This is certainly a time of year when the majority of the world is thinking and meditating upon the person and work of Jesus Christ. And when we think about who Jesus is and what he has done, there are a number of texts throughout the history of the church that have been given special attention concerning the nature of Christ. And they have played central in understanding who he is and defending that truth throughout the centuries. And so some of those texts that we deal with are John's prologue in John 1 through 18, Hebrews 1, the first 3 to 4 verses, Colossians 1, and the text we're going to give our attention to this morning, which is Philippians 2. And so as we look at this text, one of the things that I want us to see about Jesus and his lordship is that it's a lordship of service. And that many times, and when I say that this text has been one that has been discussed and debated and written on, there are entire libraries containing volumes on this text itself. However, in many of those discussions, one of the things that I have found to be true is that a good portion of them don't actually pay attention to what the text is actually saying. They debate the ins and outs, and they look at the text itself of verses 6 through 11. They lift it up, and they dissect it, and they get into all the ins and outs of that, but they forget to ask the most fundamental question. What was Paul's intention when he wrote the words? Okay? So what I want us to do is, first of all, pick the text up, verses 6 through 11, and let's look at it. Let's chart it out and see what it's saying. And then put it back down into its context. Because the context of it is something that many times is quite different than the way we want to communicate it. So, let's do this. The only way I really know how to do this is to look at these verses 6 through 11, and there's discussion about how they should be broken. Some people believe that this was an ancient hymn. That cannot be proven. That's simply a conjecture, okay? But it does have certain poetic elements to it which are undeniable, and that has led people to break them into different verse groupings. Not verses as we see them in the text of verses 6 through 11, but verses in the sense of strophes or stanzas. That if you just looked at it and took it out of its context and looked at it as a piece of literature, as a piece of writing, there seemed to be verses to it, okay? And so in the text before us, I think the best explanation of what's going on schematically in the poetic utterance itself is to see it as 6 verses. Okay, or 2 collections of 3, where he's going to be discussing a number of different things. So, verse 1, as you can see, them broken down before you, who though was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. But he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant and being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. That's the first section. Then we come and look at verses 4, 5, and 6, okay? Notice each of them have 3 lines. Therefore God has highly exalted him, bestowed upon him the name that's above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So what I want us to do then is take these supposed 6 stanzas, and I want us to chart them, okay? So when we're studying a text, we've got to look at the grammatical construction of it to see what the writer is saying, okay? You can't just look at it and be like, oh, I like that word. I'm going to talk about that word. Because that word may not be the word that the writer is trying to get you to understand. So, this is what I want us to do. This discussion, this entire text follows this V. In the first 3 verses, there is a focus on Jesus as he is in heaven and he is descending down into humanity. And then it reaches this climax in the phrase of his even death on a cross. And after that point, everything begins to shift upward in trajectory. And the focus is on God the Father. And so, as we chart this, what I want us to do is kind of see the symmetry and the things that are going on to help understand the message he's communicating. But one of the interesting things is that this begins in eternity past, as you call it. And the reason we call it that is because you can't really describe eternity. It doesn't have a beginning or an end, okay? So, to borrow from biblical language, Psalm 90, verse 2, from everlasting to everlasting you are God. So from eternity past, if you want to call it that, to eternity future. And so this begins in eternity past, where Jesus is in existence and, of course, is God himself, okay? So what I want us to do as we watch these phrases come up, and we'll discuss them a little bit, not a lot, but just a little bit, the main verbs of each verse will be in orange. Okay? The main verbs, that is the movement of the text. The other subsequent terms will be a little bit smaller in white, and they will help explain the main verb itself. Okay? And so there are 3 main verbs in the first 3 verses, and then there are 4 of them in the second 3. So let's watch them as they unfold. First of all, there's this verb translated as count in the ESV. Other translations may render it differently, but in the ESV, it is the word count. When it says, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. Okay, we'll think about that here in just a moment. So first, he's in the form of God. And the idea of being in the form of God is sharing in the shape and the nature of who God is. Okay? It's a way of saying he is God. All right? So Jesus being in the form of God, and so if we were to rank things on a matter of scale, there's not a higher point than that one, understandably. So being in the form of God, he's at the highest of highs, all right? When it comes to, and it comes out and it says he being equal with God. And so Jesus is not, as would be developed later on, in church history, he's not an emanation or a lesser being, but he is himself God. Okay? So he didn't count that as a thing to be grasped. So there's a little bit of a translation issue, and depending upon which translation you're using, you'll see it. So what does it mean here that he didn't count it or consider it? So we're looking into the thought processes of Jesus as he enters into the incarnation. Okay? As he chooses to come in the flesh and come down to humanity. He didn't consider it something to be grasped. The word translated grasped is a word that carries with it the idea of spoils. So like you go to war and you bring back the spoils of war. Okay? Some translations, and I think the King James renders it this way, did not count equality with God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God. Why do they translate it robbery? Well, because it can have some connotation with the word itself. The image that he seems to be using is this. So, if you were to take Jesus' position, okay, he is God and his position in heaven, and you have a person who has a toy. Okay, it's Christmas time, so our kids are going to get a toy. And you know how it is. Let me see the toy just a second so I can put batteries in it. No. I mean, they will fight you tooth and nail, so it won't function correctly. But I just like it like this. They're not going to let it go. That's kind of the concept here. Jesus did not consider his position in heaven as something to be grasped and held to jealously. He did not believe that it exempted him from coming after humanity to save them. That's the idea. And so in his mind, he doesn't, as one writer put it, he doesn't see the fact that he is in heaven as something that disqualifies him from saving man. He sees it as something that qualifies him to save man. So, then we come to the second main verb, that is, he emptied himself. He emptied himself. What's interesting is there's a word play here, and word plays usually only work in the language in which they're written. It's just the nature of it. Okay, it's hard to communicate a word play. But there is a word play here in the original. when it says, let nothing be done through, as the ESV says, through selfish ambition or conceit or vainglory, some translations will give it. The same word used to describe vanity or emptiness is the same word used here to describe Jesus emptying himself. And so when he's saying, don't be people who are after vainglory or for conceit, the emptiness, seeking fame just for the sake of fame, be like Jesus who was willing to empty himself. Don't seek something that is empty. Empty yourself in the service of other people. So Jesus empties himself. What all does that involve? Quite a few things. But one of which is he comes in the form of a servant. And you can see the connection, the wordplay going back. So in verse 1 of this, he is existing in the form of God. And now he empties himself and he takes on the form of a servant. And the word used to translate servant here is a word, this is the only time in the New Testament this word is applied to Jesus. The only time. It doesn't necessarily describe his status in life, okay? Jesus certainly did have a lower tier status of life. He was a poor man, okay? That's part of his ministry. He was what we would call itinerant. He went from place to place. He had people support him in that process. He did not have a home. He did not have many of the things that you and I take for granted. That was not part of him. He had nowhere to lay his head. He had a set of clothes that he wore. He had a very nice undergarment that was probably given to him by Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And so he comes in the form of a servant. And so when it comes to Jesus emptying himself, many times we look at what Jesus did on the cross and we say, he sacrificed so much. And yes, he did. There's no arguing that point. But we need to remember that when Jesus stepped out of heaven and came into human form, he sacrificed more than any of us ever will at that moment. When he became man, when he took on flesh, it was a monumental sacrifice. He confined himself to time. He entered into it. He even entered into, you remember in James 1 the discussion about temptation when he says, if a person is tempted, don't let him say I'm being tempted by God, because God can't be tempted with evil and he doesn't tempt anyone. So what does that mean then about the temptation of Jesus? When Jesus came to earth and put on human form, he subjected himself to temptation. Matthew 4, Luke 4. Things that he never would have had to bother with, he subjected himself to them. So he takes the form of a servant, and then he is made in the likeness of men. He shares in and understands what it means to be human. Then the next main verb is that he humbled himself. He humbled himself. And he does this, he gives three explanations here. First, it says, and being found in human form. That is, when people encountered him, how did they find him? That's why we call it an incarnation. He's in flesh. Okay? He's in human form. And being found in human form, he became obedient even to the point of death. Or obedient to the point of death. That is, his obedience led him to sacrifice everything that he was, his life. But then there's this qualifying statement. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to turn my fan on. There is this qualifying statement that says it was even death on a cross. Okay? So it's not just that he dies, but that he dies the death of the cross. Now, here's what we need to understand about cross. You can probably Google this and come up to it very easily. Google the Roman poet Cicero and see some of his discussions about the cross. Simply as a Roman citizen, these are my thoughts and meditations on the cross, the tree of shame, as he called it. Okay? One of the main points about the cross, it was certainly a death that was horrible, it was agonizing, it was slow, but one of the key elements of the cross was shame. The cross was public execution. Okay? That's why Jesus, when he's crucified, he and the others are put out on a public road, and then it's written, their accusations are written in multiple languages so anyone passing by can read them. And so Jesus is coming down, and so when we look at what's going on here, he could not have been any higher. He couldn't have been any higher. And in terms of human form, especially in that cultural understanding, he could not have gone any lower than dying on the cross. So that's Jesus. Now, as we said, the cross was associated with shame. You see, you and I, when we look at the cross, we kind of hold it in honor. We hold it as something that is special, and I think rightly so. But you have to understand, we are in a culture that's been deeply influenced by Christian thought. That's not the way they thought of it. There was no way in a person's mind that you could die on a cross and be considered a hero or honorable. Those two things didn't go together. Which is what makes the next statement so amazing. Because Paul becomes one of the first writers to ever associate the cross with honor. And so now it begins this focus of this trajectory of moving upward when it says that therefore God highly exalted him and bestowed upon him. Highly exalted, it's a very intensified form in its original. That is, he super exalted him. Back to the place he was before, right? That was his prayer in John 17. Let me come back to the place I was before. And so God has highly exalted him, all right, and bestowed upon him a name, but not just a name that is above every name. Now, what name it is that God bestowed upon him, it would seem contextually to me that the name that he bestowed upon him was Lord. That title. And what we have to understand is that title, we're so used to it applying to Jesus, we miss the weight of what it actually meant. Okay? What it meant to a Jewish culture and a Greco-Roman culture. What it meant to a Jewish culture, well, if you go back to the Old Testament, many times the Jews would pronounce this Hebrew term Adonai, and they would translate it Lord, L-O-R-D. Okay? But they would use that term when they came to the covenant name of God, which is Yahweh, Y-H-W-H. They would substitute Adonai for it. As a matter of fact, Dr. Gallagher, who's been here on many occasions to fill in, he studied at Hebrew Union in Cincinnati. That is a Jewish seminary where they train rabbis. They have a campus in Cincinnati and their other campus is in Jerusalem. Okay? Now, when they were reading in class and they came to the Hebrew name Yahweh, they had to insert Adonai because the covenant name of God was unpronounceable. Even when they ran copies in the library for their research, if one of the papers contained the covenant name for God, it had to be deposited in a special place. If they decided to discard it was a bad copy, they would have to deposit it in a special place where it could be disposed of in a way that was honoring the name of God. So, when Jesus is referred to as Lord, to a Jewish mind, that is calling him God. Now, to a Greco-Roman mind, Lord, Kurios, is the idea of what is connected to Caesar. Lord Caesar. That's what you say in honor of him. And so giving him a name that is above every name, and by the way, Philippi was one of the few cities, there were plenty of cities that were under the control of Rome, but none of it was considered to be Roman soil. Okay? So for an example, when we get into embassies, all right, When we get into embassies, if you have an American embassy sitting in a location, that American embassy contained in those gates is considered to be what? It's considered to be American soil. Okay? Rome didn't view it that way. The only other city that they considered to be Roman soil outside of Rome was Philippi. It's where their soldiers retired to, where they gave their allegiance to Lord Caesar. He's the only person they bowed to. He's the only person whose name they confessed allegiance to. And what Paul is saying is this: he's given him the name that's above every name. Greco-Romans, he's given him Kurios. And not only that, when his name is spoken, every knee should bow to him. Okay? At the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven, on earth, and under the earth. So that way of describing in heaven, obviously, all of the things communicated about God in heaven, that heavenly realm, and on earth, and under the earth, which most likely is a reference to the Hadean realm, the realm of the dead. The point being, however you choose to interpret this, and there are different ideas about how to interpret it, the point is still the same, and I'm not going to argue that with somebody. The point is the same. Wherever there are beings, every one of them bow their knees to Jesus. That's the point. Every knee bows. And then he says, and every tongue will confess. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they confess in a way of faith. It just simply means they acknowledge the lordship of Jesus to the glory of God the Father. So, the point being, at one point or the other, we have a choice. We can either bow our knees to Jesus now and confess with our mouths that He's the Lord. He's the one of the Old Testament. He is God Himself, the only one to whom we swear allegiance. Or on the last day, every person is going to hit their knee and they're going to acknowledge the fact that He's superior. He's exactly who He said He was. Now that when they say, oh yes, Jesus is Lord, that's not a statement of faith on their part. That's just a statement of them understanding the fact now. But ultimately, every knee is going to bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord, which is a reference back to Isaiah 45, the end, when he's talking about, in the first part we talked about in Bible class in the library this morning with Cyrus. In the second half, it's about the Lord being the only Savior of Israel and of all the earth, and knees bowing to Him and tongues confessing allegiance to Him. That's what's coming, and that is what is in eternity future. That's coming. So, if you look at what the text itself is saying, its majesty is unmatched in how it is composed, how it is put together, how it is communicated of Jesus in eternity past. He doesn't have the mindset that says, no, I'm up here and I'm not going to be bothered with anything else. I'm not going to ever humble myself or empty myself or go below myself to come down. But He does, and He comes as low as you can. And in that, God exalts Him as highly as you can. So, when people read, study, and discuss this, rightly so, they want to ask questions about the nature of Jesus. A lot of discussions that I think are good and healthy. The only problem is this: if we only have discussions that are good and healthy about certain things in the nature of the text, and we don't actually understand the text within its context, we have not honored God. We haven't honored Him. So what is this text about? Well, back up to verses 1 through 4. This is contained in a statement that is calling the church at Philippi to serve. In chapter 1 of Philippians, Paul has talked about his imprisonment and his current situation there. And now he's talking about the present state of the church. And he says, "So if there is any encouragement in Christ, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being full accord and of one mind. Do nothing through selfish ambition or conceit. In humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only for his own interests, but also the interests of others." Now, what he's talking about is that the first century, well, even before that, but the first century world in which this is written was a patron society. What is a patron society? Well, if you've ever seen a movie that deals with the mob, that's kind of what a patron society is, minus all the implied killing and, sinful stuff. But that's the idea, okay? The idea is that you have a patron. There's a relationship between the patron and the individual. So let's say I need eggs, and I don't have any chickens, and I don't have the time to invest in them and do all those things. But there's this other guy who's got tons of chickens everywhere that lay eggs. Well, I come to him and I say, I desperately need some eggs. And he says this: "You will all, as long as I'm living, you will have eggs." Well, what do I owe you? Well, nothing. If I ever need a favor, I'll call upon you. And that's the way it went. Let's say the man who needed the eggs was an undertaker, funeral director. So the man who is the patron who disperses the eggs to everyone, he has someone who dies. It's time to call upon his client and say, what? I need you to bury my loved one. And they do it. And there's no money, there's no charge in that. The New Testament world is filled with this patron-client relationship. And the patron, this is where you get tiers in society. So if you make it up, the higher up you are in patronage, the higher your status. That is, the more people that come to you and that are loyal to you and that are subservient to you because you help them, that's how you get higher. And so what does that inevitably lead to then? You can begin to, because I'm the one who is the patron, the patron, I can look down upon the individual who is the client. And by the way, this is the background to tons of issues in the New Testament. 1 Corinthians 11, the Lord's Supper, it's a patron-client issue. Allowing those class tiers to communicate and causing one to look down upon another. And so the apostle says what? Don't look out only for your own interests. Don't try and gain a big clientele. Legitimately try and serve them. Legitimately serve one another, regard one another, and don't treat these social ranks as just that. And every society that I've ever known, I've ever studied, I've ever been a part of, has had social rankings in it. And what he's saying is treat other people. The solution that Paul gives in this text is this: if you will treat every person the same way you would treat the highest of patrons, you will solve your problems. If you will love and serve every person and view them as someone who is the highest of patrons, you'll solve your problems. Now, how do you do that? That's the next part, and that's where understanding this text starts to make sense. You need the mind of Jesus. Was there ever a patron who was higher? No. Has there ever been a patron that has gone lower in serving his people? That's what this text is about. It is a wonderful text that teaches us a lot of things about the nature of Christ, sure. But when Paul penned it, he wasn't wanting us to have great councils like Nicaea and other things debating all of the ins and outs of what was going on. He wanted us to live as Jesus lived and to embrace the mindset of serving one another. And that if you view every person that you meet as the highest of patrons and you treat them that way, you won't have any problems. Because that's exactly the way Jesus treated us, who is himself the highest of patrons. Everything depends upon him. That's why we have this title, this paradox. Jesus, he's Lord, he's Kurios, he's the highest of high, but of service. That doesn't sound right. Now, to Christians that sounds right, but to people in first century culture, to put these two terms together made no sense. Humility is a character quality that you and I as Christians are supposed to prize. The Greco-Roman world did not prize humility. It was considered to be weakness. And all you have to do is read all of the philosophers who went before. They held it in disregard. Jesus came to show us the way it was supposed to be. And so we're in a holiday season where we can forget that the emphasis is not supposed to be about what we get, but rather what we give. Not about who helps us, but who we help. That's the consciousness of service. That's the mind of Jesus. He was so others-oriented. He went as low as he possibly could to lift every person out of it. And that's what he wants us to do. And so this morning, he's calling us to serve. If a person this morning, if you're outside of Jesus, I hope that you will hear that Jesus thinks so highly of you that he left heaven and came down to the lowest of lows to rescue you. And that if you will respond to his grace, and I wish we had time to talk about this grace, the three ladies of grace and the relationship of patronage and how it relates to salvation is just phenomenal. But if you'll come to him with a penitent faith, confessing Christ to be baptized in water for the forgiveness of your sins, he will forgive you and adopt you, make you his own. Or maybe as a New Testament Christian we haven't been where we should be, or maybe we're struggling with something, whatever it is. This is not the only time we can pray together, but it is a time. And if we can help you, we want to as we stand and sing this song.